For a woman with type 1 diabetes, standard fitness advice is like shooting yourself in the foot. So today I'll show you why the standard eat less and move more can be a trap for a type 1 diabetic body, and the two things that actually work instead of doing that. So I'll cover the two sides of fat loss and why cutting calories only backfires for a lot of you, and of course the two-part fix for that. Of course, this is oversimplified right now, but let's get into it and then you'll get a great understanding of what this is all about. Now, to simplify that, first of all, fat loss comes down to two sides. It's what you eat, right? The calorie consumption throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year, and so on. And also what you burn, your expenditure, which means it's your basal metabolic rate, right? What you need to burn to keep your body functioning, what you burn by exercise, what you burn by moving around all day, and so on and so forth. So just everything that you're burning, your total calorie expenditure, so to say. And that calorie expenditure, the burn side, has to be bigger to lose fat, right? So it's this typical calories in versus calories out. And to give you a better understanding of why this is correct, you need to understand a bit more context around that as well. So theoretically, this calories in versus calories out considers all the nuances, all the context about hormones, about stress management, about, for example, type 1 diabetes. So theoretically, if you considered everything, that equation would be correct all the time. If you considered the interplay between your thyroid, right, whether you, for example, have hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism, Hashimoto's, and so on and so forth, but also how much insulin you need. So theoretically, all of these things affect that equation and affect how much you burn and also how much you consume. The reason why sometimes it's not that simple, though, is that these factors, right, it's just very difficult to consider all of these. So when you want to find out what your calorie expenditure is and how much you're burning, then the most accurate thing that you can do quickly on your own is to go online to a TDEE calculator, which is total daily energy expenditure. And then based on sex, based on activity, based on, right, if they consider something like that, muscle mass, based on weight, based on age, they will tell you what you're probably burning, right? Which then usually they say something like 1,600 to 1,000 to 2,000 calories for women and something between like 1,900 to 2,400 for men. Of course, right? You can be lower than that, you can be higher than that, but just so you have a rough idea. The thing is, though, with these general calculators, this is based on statistical averages. This is not going to be true from the individual person because the standard deviation is big, especially if you're suffering from autoimmune conditions like type 1 diabetes, Hashimoto's, and right, all sorts of other things that play into that, just like also stress plays into that. And then you might end up being in a hormonal environment where, in spite of the deficit, you are not able to lose fat. So this is just like a little side note that it's, of course, theoretically true, the calories in versus calorie out model, but a lot of times it's hard to really consider all of the nuances. But still, it has a lot of relevance because, of course, right, most people are not really watching how much calories they're consuming and having the right macronutrients and so on and so forth. But to get back to my point, right, if we look at the calories in versus calories out model, this one was the expenditure, this one was how much you burn, and this one was how much you're consuming, right? The calorie consumption. And every fitness coach out there will tell you to just cut your calories and reduce what you're consuming. That has an issue, though. So it's pretty simple, but if you have type 1 diabetes, it's just not that easy because we all know that with type 1 diabetes, we will have, depending on our management, 1, 2, maybe even 3 times a day, we have to consume some sugar, right? Some carbohydrates to get our sugar back up if we have a hypo, if we have a low sugar. And then we're forcing sugar into that equation. So we cut our calories, trying to lose fat, trying to lose weight. And then we have to consume some sugar and it's going back up. So it's hard for us to always stick with that, okay? So you treat that low with sugar, and so the calories go back in. And to stick with the deficit, to still stick with that deficit, you have to cut what's left. So again, right, you were in a deficit, then you had a hypo, you're consuming sugar, you're consuming carbohydrates, and you're back out of the deficit. And if you still want to be in a deficit in the end of the day, then you have to cut what's left, which is the proteins and the fats. That's an issue though, because these are the exact things that you need for, right, again, stable blood sugar, to make sure that this is not happening more often, for healthy hormonal environment, right, to support hormones, to support digestion, to support detoxification. So all organs is, in the end of the day, right, depend on having healthy fats, depend on having the amino acids like the proteins. So these are the things that you have to cut, right? If you constantly have to consume sugar to correct your hypos, and that's then in the end of the day like a race to the bottom, because you end up again and again, you end up cutting the things that are actually vital for your health, for your hormonal health, and so on. So by then cutting the healthy fats and proteins, because you force sugar into the equation with your type 1 diabetes, then you're just going to have more of the blood sugar roller coaster, because again, the fats and the proteins are what's so important. And that's the case, right? If you only focus on eating less, if that's the first thing that you're doing with your diet. So you've eaten too little of the right things in the end of the day, and you end up in the blood sugar roller coaster, which leads to even more cravings and eating even less of the right things, because again, you're forcing sugar into the equation, and then you have to cut the proteins and the fats again. It's like this race to the bottom that I often talk about, that you can't win, because the bottom gets really close, and then there's just no way of you just cutting more and more over time by just eating less all the time. Your metabolism adapts to that, and you have to eat less and less and less. So that's the big issue with just like forcing the calorie deficit with type 1 diabetes. You have to force sugar back into the equation. Now, the way we go about this, right, because after all, the calorie deficit still is important, it's not going away, is very straightforward. We need, instead of just eating less, we need to focus on stabilizing the blood sugar, improving the time and range, because if there's less of the hypos in the first place, less of the low blood sugars in the first place, that helps us forcing less of that sugar into the equation, right? So if instead of every single day, 1 to 3 times a day, I have a low blood sugar, a hypo, just once a day, or maybe just once every second or every third day, ideally, then I'm like way less often, I'm forced to actually consume sugar to get my blood sugar back up, right? And the way I go about that with all of my type 1 diabetic clients is making sure, first of all, we establish a certain discipline, right? When it comes to the pre-bolus, so when you have carbs, depending on what foods you have, that we observe the patterns that are there, right? The highs, the lows, etc. And we work on this, and we establish a certain discipline, which means, right, if you know, hey, your sugar is still high, depending on what scales you're using, is at a 10 if you're using millimole, or 180 is if you're using milligrams per deciliter, and you want to eat, then no, you go ahead and you inject insulin to correct that, and you wait a bit. When it goes down, you can start eating, right? It's a really simple example. Or the second thing would be pre-bolusing. So if you have rice or super fast-acting carbs, and you're not necessarily taking a walk right after your meal, or have taken a walk just before the meal, then you would need to go ahead and inject the insulin 20-ish minutes earlier, right? Of course, also coordinating that with your endo, but using a pre-bolus to really like catch the high and make sure it's not going, your sugar is not going sky high from carbohydrates. So there's a certain discipline with the pre-bolusing and so on and so forth, and also a certain discipline when it comes to stopping your food 4 hours before you go to sleep, right? Have your dinner, if you go to sleep 11 p.m., have your dinner at 7 and then stop eating. Because, right, if you're having like big carbohydrate snack or late night pizza 1 hour before bed, of course, right, you're going to go high at night. The second thing to really improve the time and range generally will be having the right foods. And if you're curious about finding a start to that, right, like what's a good breakfast option, for example, what's generally good options, then go ahead on Instagram, send me a direct message or comment on some of the posts, the word meal guide, right, meal guide, and then I'll send over like a good structure that helps stabilize sugar throughout the day. First of all, so what I'm saying is that the right foods will help improve your time and range, because of course there will be foods that are more and less blood sugar friendly, right? Having enough proteins, fiber, and carbohydrates, right, in a specific way, and depending on what you actually need. Because if you base the carbohydrates that you need on your actual demand based on the training that you're doing, your activity, age, and so on and so forth, stress level, and so on and so forth, then you're going to have an easier time staying in your staying in your range, right, in your blood sugar range. And the third thing would be training and actually tackling that blood sugar management by the root cause, which is daily activity, right? Moving around. So your muscles actually need the sugar, and then like very easily your muscles will pull sugar out of your blood, literally, which then helps, right, keep blood sugar stable longer in an easier way. Strength training is a super important component of that, and also, of course, walking. Right, taking your daily steps, walking around, and a lot of people, when you do something like team sports or something like fighting or even horse riding, I don't know, like whatever you're into, that of course also helps, but goes more to and falls more to the category of daily activity, which helps. But on top of the daily activity, we also need to make sure that there's something like progressive strength training, where your muscles are getting the ability over time to use up more glucose, because that's one of the mechanisms your muscles adapt, by being able to use up more glucose and do more work, which literally means using up more glucose while you're working out. And then they become these, you could think of these like engines that are able to burn more. So it's a bit like you going from like a super slow car to being a sports bike, because you're growing your engine and you're able to use up more fuel, which with a car you wouldn't necessarily want, because the car is going to be more expensive, because you have to buy more fuel after all. But for your body, it's an actual healthy thing, an actual good thing, because if you're more energy inefficient and you're using up more fuel, you're having an easier time stabilizing blood sugar, because your body suddenly needs starts needing that fuel, which in that case is the carbohydrates, which is the fuel for us as humans, right? So that's how we stabilize blood sugar in a lasting way. Okay. So if we sum that up, fewer lows because of a better time in range means less or fewer forced corrections, which means less sugar pushed back into the equation, and then you're going to have an easier time staying in the calorie deficit while keeping your healthy foods, proteins, healthy fats, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you follow me on Instagram, you'll constantly see examples of clients with type 1 diabetes, or sometimes even type 2 diabetes, improving their time in range tremendously and reducing and cutting the amount of insulin they need by 50%, sometimes, right? Sometimes like from before, that they just need half of the insulin, or like a quarter of the insulin that they needed before, because suddenly that mechanism that I just described kicks in, and it's easier to stay time in range, and they suddenly reach a lot of days with 100% time in range, 90+% time in range, a better A1C or HbA1c depending on where you're located, and less insulin needed long term. Okay, so that's the first really important mechanism. The second one, and that's the non-negotiable. If we go back to the equation, and now it's easier for us to stay in the deficit, because what we did is we had fewer lows and we're forcing less sugar into the equation. The next one is actually going the other way, raising the expenditure, because one of the other issues that I mentioned before, if you remember, is that when you reducing your calorie burn and how much you're not the burn. If you're reducing how much you're consuming, how much you're eating, then your metabolism adapts to that and it gets slower over time. And that's what I call the race to the bottom, because every time you eat less over an extended period in time, then your burn also starts adapting, because our bodies want to save us. And that's also what I mentioned in the very beginning, is that these equations and the online expenditure calculators that you'll find, they are simplified. They are based on statistical averages, but if you've eaten a certain amount of calories, and I had several examples also, if you follow me on my socials, then you will see that there's several clients that I work with that had like half of what they actually needed statistically, in terms of how much they've eaten calorie-wise. So they had 1,200, 1,400 calories over years, while they would actually need more, something like 2,400, 2,500, 2,200 based on their activity level, height, and so on and so forth. So what happens in these scenarios is that your expenditure also goes lower because your body wants to save you. So it slows down all of these processes in the body because it wants to save you from starving, because that's the mechanism it detects, so to say. So again, coming back to the equation, the other way we want to prevent that race to the bottom is we want to raise the expenditure in the first place. And one way to do so, but that's not the one that I'm talking about today with you, is of course of eating enough and eating enough of the right things. But the other way of doing so is implementing strength training and building muscle. Because as I described before, right, muscle, once you grow your muscle and you grow also the glycogen storages in the muscles, which is one of the mechanisms our muscles get bigger. There are several mechanisms, but one of them is actually, right, that the storage, the glycogen storage in our muscles can grow, so that there is something that we could call, is like a bit nerd talk, but we could call that glycogen supercompensation, right? Because we are using up the glycogen in our muscles if we're doing a certain amount of repetitions in the strength training. And then next time that storage grows, so to say, because that's how our body adapts to us doing more work, like using a certain weight with a certain amount of volume, right? Certain amount of repetitions that I use, move the weight. So that's how you can think of it. And that's what we want to do, because that has a lasting effect on our insulin sensitivity, right? Growing muscle, increasing our metabolic rate, therefore has a lasting effect on our insulin sensitivity. And if you've been consistently doing strength training, then you will know that as a default, even if you rest for a week or two, you will still need way less insulin than someone that has less muscle, that is less trained and has less strength than you. Okay, and that's how you can have a lasting effect on that blood sugar management, because again, if your muscles are pulling more sugar out of your blood, you're having a way easier time controlling the blood sugar, because next to the insulin, now there's something else controlling your blood sugar, right? It's at least how we could call it. And if you compare that with other activities like dancing or horse riding and stuff like that, then if you're stopping that for a week, then you will realize that suddenly your insulin demand goes way higher again, because suddenly you're stopping the activity. So there is a difference between the activity, like the daily walks and so on and so forth, affecting your time in range and affecting your blood sugar levels, and actually having a lasting effect on that time in range. Okay, and that's the crucial difference. We want to have the lasting effect on top of the general activity. So stick with the activities that you love, the Zumba class, the Pilates class, the walking, and so on and so forth. But the strength training falls into a different category here and has this lasting effect on your insulin sensitivity. And that, of course, needs to be programmed in a specific way to actually have that effect. But that's going to be too much for now. Okay. If you're also interested in how to approach that, then you can also always go ahead and send me a direct message on Instagram saying protocol. And then I will send you a free starting program to improve that insulin sensitivity and therefore blood sugar management, okay? So again, the second part of how we go about the whole fat loss journey of how you go about that as a woman with type 1 diabetes, next to controlling the time and range, is increasing the expenditure, and that is smart strength training. And on top of that, also there's intervals that you can do, which are also meanwhile shown to have a lasting effect on your muscles, right? A long-term adaptation effect on your muscles. But that's in a nutshell how we want to raise how we want to raise the expenditure. And also, right, with my clients, that's because that's the reason they, even after a year of working with me, they still come to me saying, hey, I'm still down at the weight that we reached together. And that's how they can make a lasting effect, because they now know not just how to approach their food, but also how to train in a way, and write their training programs later on in a way that then allows them to keep that blood sugar off and make it a lasting effect, as opposed to you going ahead and doing a 12-week challenge where you're just eating less and you're doing more, I don't know, YouTube workouts whatsoever, and then you're losing some weight. But once you stop it, or you're less strict for a week, then you're going back to where you started, because it hasn't had a lasting effect on your metabolism, insulin sensitivity, and therefore weight loss journey overall. Okay, so that's everything we want to discuss for today. Again, if you're curious about how to specifically start with the food or the training, DM me meal guides and or protocol for the food part and the training part on Instagram, so I can send you some starting protocols that also my clients use to lose half a kilogram or a kilogram of body fat a week. So go ahead, send me these messages there. But if we recap that again, fat loss comes down to the equation of calories in versus calorie out, which is the expenditure, how much you're burning, and also the consumption, how much calories you're consuming. And right, with the typical approach of just going in a deficit, this is going to be difficult with type 1 diabetes because calories are being forced back into the equation with sugar. The way we're approaching that is improving the time in range, so we have less calories being forced back into the equation and raising the expenditure in the first place. Okay, so remember that. That's going to be how you're losing fat for a lifetime as a woman with type 1 diabetes. Now, again, comment meal guide or protocol under one of my posts on Instagram, or send me a direct message if you want me to help you out further. See you in the next one.